Chapter 2. Ellis was strapped in and asleep, and Jess obviously wasn't in the mood to talk. He stared sullenly at the vidscreen from the co-pilot seat, at the passing black of space, as he'd done for the last 4 hours. Not a word, and although Lara wouldn't have minded a little conversation, she didn't want to invade his privacy. Privacy on the small shuttle meant closing your eyes when someone needed to pee, a difficult enough activity in zero grav. If Jess wanted to be alone with his thoughts, she could at least give him that. Not much point in making small talk anyway. Lara closed her tired, grainy eyes for a moment, amazed that the thought of their upcoming deaths hadn't lost any of its punch. They'd lived with it for almost 3 days, and it still made her stomach knot each time she thought of it, even after the nightmare of 949. She'd been prepared then, with other lives depending on her actions. Now, though, she didn't want to die. And she particularly didn't want to die from asphyxiation in a cramped, cold shuttle in the depths of space. Even with the patch job on the filters, they only had another 15, 20 hours of breathe time. And though DS-949 hadn't been as DS as most, the shuttle's bare-bones navigation system was strictly self-contained. No hookups, not even a list of planets or toids in the quadrant. It had been designed as a go-between, ship to shore, not for deep space transport, which meant, simply, that if there was anywhere to go, they weren't going to find it. She opened her eyes, looking again at the trail of glowing green numbers on the small console screen. They'd been headed .82 since bailing from the terminal, only because she thought she remembered a survey office somewhere in the low 8s. It was a long shot, but it wasn't like they had any alternatives. If they were on the Nemesis, they'd have been picked up by now. Their old ship had been wired for serious range. And it was blown to shit along with Pop, the station, and about 1 million alien bugs. Why not wish for something you can have, like freeze-dried bean curd, or a nap? Sleep sounded good. She'd caught a few hours earlier, but it'd been more like falling unconscious than real sleep. Ellis had been knocked out for most of their trip, which was just as well. The Max interface had done a number on him, and not just physically. The kid had saved their lives, for what it was worth, but it had cost him. Lara glanced at Jess and tried to remember the last time he'd slept. Just after the escape, she thought. The loss of Teep and Candyman had been bad for him, worse than for her or for Ellis. Both men had died badly, and under his command. She tried telling him that it was Pop's fault, Pop and the company's greedy indifference to the Max teams, but Jess seemed determined to take it on himself. 60 hours? More? Jess, you want to catch a few Z's? I'll stay up, make sure the beacon doesn't conk out. Jeff started as if frozen from a trance. He looked over to her, his face expressionless. No, that's okay. I'm good. Lara studied him, his deep brown features set into grim lines, the exhaustion and hurt and shame in his gaze. Tired and sad she could live with, but she'd left him alone about what had happened for long enough. Too long, maybe. Martin, it wasn't you, she said softly, and saw him wince ever so slightly, a tightening around his mouth and eyes. And you know it. Why are you doing this? Jess looked away, staring down at the back of his hands. I don't want to talk about this. Lara shook her head, feeling a sudden rush of anger at him, at his stupid male need to keep it all for himself. Well, that's too bad, Jess. What if it was all my fault? If I told you about how weird Pop was acting? Maybe you could have stopped him. Or Ellis. Why don't you put it on him? If he'd gotten into Max a few minutes earlier, they might still be alive. Why you? Why do you want to take responsibility for this? For a moment, he didn't answer, his jaw clenched, his mouth a thin line. The low hum of the cyclers was all there was to hear, pushing barely warmed air through the dying filters. Lara wondered if she'd gone too far. She'd been contracted, ex-Marine, while Jess and his 2 men had been fighting XTs in lieu of prison time. There was always a distance between the volunteers and the company staff. And to hell with it. We're going to die together. To hell with going too far. It doesn't matter anymore. If it ever did. Jess finally looked up at her, and because she expected him to be defensive and angry, she was a little surprised by the open sorrow she saw across his weary features. Because no one else will, he said. Pop's dead, and Weyland-Yutani had a sacrifice before we even got the call. There's no one else to feel shitty about what happened, to be responsible. He sighed again, looking away. They deserve that, he said, so quietly that she didn't think he'd meant it for her. His reasoning was terrible, but she could see through the rough logic in it. For a man who hadn't slept in 3 days, it probably made perfect sense. Ellis wasn't the only one damaged by what had happened. Tell you what, she said gently. You sleep, and I'll think about Teep and Pulaski for a while. Jess blinked. Don't patronize me, Lara. She shook her head. No, really. You're right. Everyone thought they were expendable. The company wanted us dead for finding out that the infestation came in on one of their ships. No witnesses, Pop said. And whatever data they wanted off that log, it meant more to them than any of us. Teep and the Candyman were good guys, and they deserved better than what they got. It's still not your fault, but I understand what you're saying. Lara took a deep breath and met his gaze evenly. Go rest. I'll stay up and watch things, and I'll carry it for a while, okay? It was Jess's turn to study her, and he must have seen that she meant it, because after a moment he nodded slowly. Okay, he said. Just a few minutes. He unstrapped himself and floated past her chair, headed to one of the wall slings at the rear, next to where Ellis slept and the Max sat, cold and empty and dead. Lara leaned back, closing her eyes, feeling useless. Jess would get some sleep anyway. That was good. Wouldn't want to meet oblivion with bags under your eyes. Lord knows you want to be well rested, sharp and alert, so that you can panic fully when you start to lose consciousness. She told herself to shut up and thought about Teep and Candyman Pulaski, about how they died. It wasn't much of a favour to Jess. She thought of little else since she'd left the terminal. She thought of Ellis climbing into the suit to save Jess in spite of the interference that had fucked him up so thoroughly. Of the poor bastard who'd been inside the Max first, who died alone and insane in their metal shell because the company had put him there. Of Eric Pop Izzard, her lover, who had made a deal and screwed all of them. And of the 400 people of DS-949 who were no more because somebody had fucked up on quarantine. All of that, and how they were going to die soon. Lara opened her eyes and started looking through the scant computer files on quadrant layout for the 100th time. She had nothing better to do. Ellis woke up with the same headache he'd had for years, or what seemed like years. For just a moment he didn't know where he was or why he was surrounded by clingy web, by lines of dusty thread that lay across his skin like a cold whisper. And then he saw the dented orange metal of Max's massive right arm some 3 meters away, the blackened metal of its flamethrower hand reflecting the bare light beneath the securing straps, and closed his eyes again. Safe. I'm safe. My name is Brian Ellis. Brian Ellis, I'm 24, A-level in synth repair and contracted by Weyland-Yutani, and I'm in the shuttle from... For a second, he could only see images. A plain bunk, a cramped room with thick, plexi windows, and the giant steel table where Max slept. A stats med console, blue lines pulsing across. He saw Pop's angry face, and then a dead and rotting body, its face grinning, a decaying, stinking man on the floor of 949, just after he'd brought Max over from... Nemesis, he whispered, and felt a rush of relief. Compared to before, the name had come easily. As he'd done each time he'd awakened on the shuttle, he brought himself up to date, checking for lapses. The first time he'd opened his eyes after the station, all he'd known was Lara's name and his own age. They, were on the shuttle from the Nemesis. He'd been part of a MAX team, assigned to monitor the machine's human occupant and run its program in order to clear XT infestations. 33, first 011.2 away. And they'd gone to Deep Space Terminal 949, and he'd gone into MAX himself when everything had gone wrong, when Pop had deserted the team and the man in MAX had died, his wasted body pushed too far by the synth adrenaline. Max's interface had been designed to fit into a surgical implant, which Ellis didn't have. The prongs had pierced his skull, and he and Max had become one perfect machine that dealt death from both hands, wiping the bugs. Space 17.25, object .9, the animals cooking in their shells, acid boiling. My name is Brian. Ellis blinked, forcing himself to think clearly. The station had been fail-safed, and Lara had picked them up in the shuttle, in this shuttle, he and Jess, and the interface had not been perfect. It had done damage, possibly long-term, but then he'd probably never know. He heard a soft grunt from the mesh bunk below, and looked down to see that Jess was asleep. Even in rest, his features were strained, his hands in fists. He was sad and angry, grieving over the Candyman and the man with the thin, twitchy face and haunted eyes. The bait. The volunteer who found the egg chamber by letting himself be caught. Teep. Teep, the Candyman had called him. TP. Getting better, and how much time, how long now? He knew the air filters were going. He'd at least gotten that much in one of his earlier bouts of consciousness. Once they wound down, the area would turn to poison in a few hours. Strangely, the thought wasn't as terrible as it should have been. Ellis sat up slowly, pulling the tab on the bunk and letting himself roll out into the frigid air, careful not to bump into Jess. The scabbed wound on the back of his head itched beneath the plastical patch, but it wasn't throbbing anymore and he didn't feel like throwing up. A definite improvement. He pulled his glasses out of his front pocket and slipped them on, the tight interior of the shuttle instantly becoming sharper and even smaller than it was when it was a blur. Lara was at the ops console in the front, slouched in front of the nav screen. Ellis shifted himself to one side and pulled himself along using the handholds on the wall, waiting until he was well away from Jess before speaking. Lara? She turned and he saw the exhausted worry in her eyes. For just a second before she pasted on a shaky smile, a few tendrils of her long hair swirling around her face. Hey Ellis, how are you feeling? Her concern, at least, seemed genuine. A lot better. I can remember things pretty clearly now, I think. I've still got a headache, but not as bad. Lara nodded, her smile a little more real. That's great. I'm really glad to hear it. Are you hungry? You haven't eaten since 1400 yesterday? Ellis pulled himself closer, grabbing the moulded plastic arm of the other chair. How long was I asleep? 14, 15 hours? Don't worry, we still got almost a full day left and plenty of power on the signal. Someone could still hear us. Catherine Lara had been a second lieutenant in the USCMC before having her contract bought up by the company, and had proved herself to be fast and graceful under extreme pressure. But she couldn't lie for shit. As out of it as he'd been, Ellis had still been able to comprehend that their chances were 1 in a million. Lara started digging through one of the packs hanging on the wall as Ellis moved to the chair and sat, loosely strapping himself in. Let's see, we've got soy pro in sweet and sour, grilled with onion, fish and veggie, and there's 1 lemon chicken left. Ellis shrugged. All kind of taste the same anyway. No, the chicken's not so bad. The texture's really close. She handed him the thin pack, and Ellis pulled the plastic spork off the side and unzipped the seal. In 9.61 seconds, scented steam rose from the pouch, and he realized that he was ravenous. He burned his mouth on the first few bites, not caring at all. What'd I tell you? Lara said. Way better than the beef. Ellis nodded, swallowing, thinking of how much things had changed for him in only a few days. He'd been a novice tech before DS949, signing up for the Max team to make up for a lifetime of feeling powerless, of being too skinny, too smart, too socially inept. His own father had ridiculed him for his weakness. And now, I'm dazed and in pain. We're probably going to die, and I don't know that I've ever felt more at peace. I did something. I made the decision, and then we made it happen. Being side of Max had been... they had been important. Now that his mind was his own again, he would be able to live his final hours with some real dignity, with the awareness that when things had gotten bad, he and Max had acted. He finished the chicken and turned to see Lara dozing in her seat, her slender neck arching back, strands of reddish hair that had escaped her ponytail forming a gentle halo around her pale face. She was beautiful. He thought so since joining the Nemesis team, but hadn't thought she could possibly be interested in him. Still, he had clear memories of her sweet and frowning face in front of his, the sound of her kind, lilting voice reaching into the haze of confusion that had taken up so much of the past. 74 hours estimate, 14 minutes variable. Few days. Maybe it was only because he'd been sick, or wishful thinking on his part. Or maybe she sees me differently now, because I'm not the same dumbass kid I was. Ellis leaned back in his chair, thinking that it didn't really matter if she liked him in that way. What mattered was that it was possible, that for the first time in his life he felt like someone, a pretty woman no less, might actually be impressed by him. First, and maybe last. Ellis watched her sleep, feeling a deep sense of contentment. He'd been a hero, if only for a little while. The mind inside of a mobile assault exo-warrior, a giant with hands of fire and death. It was a dream he could live, for as long as they had left.